Contented Media presents Dr. Bitcoin, the man who wasn't Satoshi Nakamoto, an original podcast series with Mark Hunter and Arthur Van Pelt.
Hello and welcome to another bonus episode of Dr. Bitcoin, the man who wasn't Satoshi Nakamoto, in which we delve into the stories that we don't have time to examine in the monthly episodes, but which demand more investigation. This month, we're going to focus on the latest happenings in the Pineapple hack case, which recently saw the defendants file their first rebuttals of Craig Wright's fantastic arguments. And with me as ever to dive into the documents is Arthur Van Pelt. Arthur, this is a pretty important chapter in the Craig Wright narrative, isn't it?
Well, yeah, sort of. And as always, thanks for having me, Mark. But what's important in this lawsuit is not that Craig Wright is claiming to own some Bitcoin on those addresses, like it's about the 1 Feeks and the 12 IB7 addresses, because everyone knows that's a lie supported by forgeries and bookkeeping fraud again. So that's not very interesting in the big picture. So no, what's interesting here is the question of fiduciary duties of the developers. We all presumed there are none in generally decentralized open source projects like Bitcoin, but will a judge see the same? And that will be very interesting to see ruled about someday. And I mean, Craig Wright himself will not benefit of such a ruling, Mark, either way, because he won't be able to prove that he ever owned the Bitcoin that he claimed to own. But in the big picture, what does the court think about fiduciary duties of open source developers? Very interesting.
Yes, it certainly is. Now, we covered the broad areas of the defendants' arguments in our May update, but given the importance of this case and the fact that there are three groups of defendants, all with slightly different defences, it's important to know where we stand at this critical point in proceedings. Just a note before we continue, listeners may recognise some of the content from last month's update, but rest assured there's plenty of new stuff too. To give a bit of background, Wright claims that 110,000 BTC, BCH and BSV coins were stolen from him in a February 2020 hack, with the coins allegedly under the ownership of Tulip Trading Limited, TTL, at the time. Wright is seeking to prove that blockchains should be bound by court orders and is demanding that the coins be reminted and held for him, but the case has wider implications. Were he to win, it would mean that developers of open source software owe a fiduciary duty to users in defiance of the MIT open source license. Wright filed his original particulars of claim back in April 2021, which were amended in February 2023 following his appeal victory, which is how this case got to court in the first place. 16 defendants were initially served, including a selection of seemingly random Bitcoin developers, some of whom hadn't worked on the protocol for years before Wright's filing, 2 Bitcoin Cash ABC, now eCash developers, Roger Ver in his capacity as an alleged Bitcoin Cash developer, and the Bitcoin Association for BSV. Please be aware, the eCash developers are called variously Bitcoin Cash developers, Bitcoin ABC developers, and eCash developers throughout the filings, which can get a bit confusing, but they all mean eCash developers. Arthur, the Bitcoin Association for BSV are no longer involved in this case. What happened to them?
Well, they settled with Craig Wright, Mark, in June 2022. Let me quote for you what happened back then, and the judge of this case summarized it in an order. That order says, upon the parties having reached agreement and upon the first defendant, which is the BSV Association, undertaking to the claimant that it will develop and make available on its website within 30 days from the date of this order a program to be used on the BSV network by a suitable legal entity for translating court orders or documents of comparable force, affecting BSV into machine-readable format, which is a digitalized order, the judge says, broadcasting such digitalized order to miners and collect, freeze and unfreeze order consent responses from the miners' nodes, the notary tool, they call it. So by consent, it is ordered that the claim against the first defendant shall be dismissed, no order as to costs, and this order shall be served by the first defendant, which was the BSV Association, on the claimant. Well, that's it, Mark.
The remaining defendants are, naturally, defended by different law firms, with the 10 Bitcoin developers represented by Enyo Law, the Bitcoin Cash developers represented by Cook, Young and Kaiden, and Roger Ver represented by Brett Wilson LLP. Roger Ver entered his defense on April 5th, the Bitcoin developers entered theirs on April 26th, and the Bitcoin Cash developers entered theirs a week later. Right off the bat, we got a flavour for how this is going to be fought, with the Bitcoin developers making their case clear from the outset. Quote, "This is a fraudulent claim. TTL does not own the digital assets it claims to own in these proceedings and has never owned them. TTL has made a deliberately false claim to ownership of those assets and has commenced these proceedings knowing that it has no claim in respect of those assets. The claim is accordingly an abuse of the court's process." Unquote. Similarly, the eCash developers didn't mess about when it came to their opening gambit. Quote, "The claim is both fraudulent and legally misconceived. The claimant seeks an order intended to give it ownership of cryptocurrency worth billions of US dollars, alternatively damages or equitable compensation in that sum. It never owned or controlled that cryptocurrency in the first place, and the evidence on which it relies is manufactured." Unquote. Arthur, Roger Ver didn't start with a summary dismissal of Wright's claims. He offered something altogether more spectacular, didn't he?
Oh, absolutely. It is pretty clear that Roger Ver and Craig Wright are absolutely no friends anymore, Mark. And that shows indeed in a quite spectacular defense of him. No less than 6 pages are spent on describing Craig's false and fraudulent antics all over the world, from his company Tulip Trading Limited to, and that part is no less than 5.5 pages long, all kinds of court dealings over the years where Craig was found a liar and a fraud, in summary. And of course his whole claim of ever having owned the 1 Feex and 12 IB7 addresses with in total 110,000 coins. And for Roger Ver, his network, that is the BCH token, is being rejected by Roger.
Ver also got personal with regard to his relationship with Wright, saying that Wright has a, quote, long-standing personal animosity, unquote, towards him, and has described Ver as his enemy, as well as making, quote, a series of disparaging and defamatory comments, unquote, about Ver. Naturally, all 3 filings include denials that Wright is Satoshi Nakamoto, with Ver saying that this is merely Wright's alter ego rather than his pseudonym, which I thought was a nice touch. Ver and the eCash developers all state that, rather than Wright being renowned for being Satoshi Nakamoto, he is in fact renowned as, quote, an individual who claims to be Satoshi Nakamoto, unquote, adding that, quote, the renown which it is alleged Dr. Wright enjoys is denied, unquote. Arthur, what did the Bitcoin developers have to say about Wright's Satoshi claims?
Oh, please listen, Mark, this is so good. I'll quote. Dr. Wright is not Satoshi and did not create the Bitcoin system. In particular, Dr. Wright's claim that he is Satoshi has been discredited in the cryptocurrency community. Dr. Wright has displayed ignorance of obvious matters concerning the Bitcoin system, of which the inventor of the system, which is the real Satoshi, whoever that is, would not be ignorant. As examples of this, paragraphs 44.2 and 46.1 below are repeated. Now, Mark, note that I just mentioned 2 paragraph numbers, 44.2 and 46.1, and these are so good, so I will read them to you also. It is denied that the use of private keys prevent double counting. As the inventor of Bitcoin would know, the feature of the Bitcoin system, which allows double spends to be prevented in the decentralized setting, is proof of work. Craig Wright says that private keys prevent double counting or double spending. No, and that is of course not correct. The other paragraph says the reasons why a private key is required to transfer Bitcoin include the following, of which it is averred the inventor of Bitcoin, Satoshi, would be aware. It is inherent in the design of the Bitcoin system that the user's private keys are required to undertake a transaction. It would be inconsistent with the foundational principles of the Bitcoin system to permit access to coins without the private key. If Dr. Wright were Satoshi, it would be easy for him to attempt to prove that, for example, by releasing the original document of the white paper that Satoshi published in 2008, or the pre-release builds of Bitcoin.exe, or using the relevant private key to sign a message on the Genesis block or any of the public addresses known to be controlled by Satoshi, or releasing the original private correspondence between Satoshi and other members of the community, or signing a message with Satoshi's well-known PGP key. However, Dr. Wright has not done so because it is to be inferred that he is not Satoshi. So yeah, amen to that, Mark. Craig Wright at his best. He has no idea how Bitcoin works, and especially who do know how Bitcoin works, it becomes so easy to pinpoint and expose his inconsistencies. And that's exactly what the Bitcoin developers have been doing in their defense.
The Bitcoin developers then hit Wright where it hurts, his qualifications, and their arguments are worth reading out in full. Quote, Dr. Wright does not have a computer science degree. Dr. Wright does not have the ability to code C++, alternatively does not have anything beyond the ability of a beginner. Dr. Wright failed his Theory of Computation course in his Information Systems Security program at Charles Sturt University. The Theory of Computation course was the only true computer science course in the curriculum. Dr. Wright does not have a significant publication history or impact factor in computer science journals. Dr. Wright's claims to renown are heavily disputed in the cryptocurrency and scientific communities. Dr. Wright has, in other proceedings, given deliberately false evidence as to matters concerning his scientific standing, such as invitations to academic conferences and the supposed acceptance of academic papers following peer review. It is to be inferred that he is not a renowned computer scientist because such a person would not give, or need to give, false evidence about their standing in the scientific community. Unquote. Arthur, are we to infer from this that the Bitcoin developers have got hold of some extra evidence that stands these allegations up?
Yeah, I think you can be assured of that, Mark. There's evidence for each and every single point on this list, and as it happens, I just tweeted out the screenshot of Craig's Charles Sturt diploma, where indeed the line with theory of computation has been set to a 0, which means completely failed. And the text that I tweeted out was, while Satoshi was coding up Bitcoin in 2007 and 2008, showcasing substantial experience in computer science, Craig Wright was meanwhile still following IT courses touching on computer science, but he failed theory of computation, which is the only computer science course that he had at that moment.
Jesus.
So this conman now claims that Bitcoin is Turing complete. Well, everybody knows it isn't, but he keeps on saying that Bitcoin is Turing complete. Well, but not to brag, Mark, but this tweet went a little viral in the hours after I posted it. And so I'm no doubt if I have that information, all the Bitcoin developers have all that information too, because almost all of that the information is public anyway. Yeah. Because, for example, the university paper came from Craig Wright's own blog, buried deep away in his wheelbarrow of qualifications.
Verse signed off his opening statements by denying Wright's suggestion of BSV being Bitcoin and everything else before and since being airdrops, saying, quote, "The use of the term airdrop to refer to a hard fork is contentious and apt to mislead because the term airdrop is commonly used to refer to the practice of an unsolicited distribution of a digital token. The allegation that the BCH network, whatever that is intended to mean, is not a legitimate network of Bitcoin, whatever that is intended to mean, is vague, imprecise, and denied. Dr. Wright is a vocal proponent of Bitcoin BSV. It appears that this litigation is motivated by Dr. Wright's desire to discredit alternative Bitcoin software." Unquote. You're not wrong, Roger. The Bitcoin developers ended their initial arguments against the first part of Wright's particulars of claim by saying that it amounted to an abusive process. Quote, "It is averred that this claim is an abusive process because it has been bought by TTL fraudulently in the knowledge that it has no claim. As to this, Dr. Wright and TTL do not have and have never had an interest of any kind in the digital assets in the addresses. Dr. Wright and TTL must necessarily have known this and did know it. This claim is an abusive process because Dr. Wright and TTL have known at all material times that TTL has no claim." Unquote. One of the key aspects of this case is the operation of nodes and the question of whether Bitcoin is really decentralized or not. In his particulars of claim, Wright has this to say about nodes, quote, "The operation of the network is underpinned by a network of nodes, or miners. Nodes are devices or data points on the network and, typically, are computers. The nodes, and those operating them, undertake what is commonly referred to as mining." Unquote. Wright goes on to add, as we would expect, that non-mining nodes don't count as nodes because they fulfill no function on the network, hence why Bitcoin is heavily centralized around just a handful of miners. This, of course, is something he has been saying for some time, having promised to take tweets from his legal targets who propound Bitcoin's purported 5-figure node count as evidence of perjury in court. The Bitcoin developers, unsurprisingly, disagree with Wright's assessment, referring to nodes as, quote, "a peer-to-peer network that would, using the necessary software, verify transactions by applying a decentralized consensus mechanism," unquote. Roger Ver agrees and clarifies the distinction. Quote, "Certain nodes limit their activities to broadcasting transfers to other nodes. Other nodes carry out a part of the validation process, commonly described as mining. It is accordingly inaccurate to refer to all nodes as carrying out mining." Unquote. This sentiment is echoed by the Bitcoin Cash developers, who reinforce Ver's distinction and clarify that the various networks involved are all made up of mining nodes and non-mining nodes. Arthur, we have the first of the battle lines drawn here for this case. How does it help Wright's case to claim that only miners can class themselves as nodes, and how would he prove it?
To be honest, I have no idea, Mark. I mean, it's perfectly clear for pretty much anyone who's paying attention to Bitcoin that Satoshi Nakamoto coded up a Bitcoin node in 2008 who was by default only verifying incoming transactions and blocks. When such a non-mining node approved a block, it would add it to the local chain and relay the block to all peer nodes, whether they were mining or not. And to add, mining was only an option that could be switched on and off. And I don't know if you have any experience with IT design,
No.
but when a state of a node is optional, it can never be declared the default state of a node anymore, because it isn't.
Yeah.
And Craig and his camp is trying to downplay the role of a non-mining node, while Satoshi gave a non-mining node a distinct and important role in the Bitcoin network from the start. So how will Craig Wright, the self-proclaimed Satoshi, prove that Satoshi was wrong to do that in the early days? Why would he go that path anyway, when it is such a clear nonsense that is easily disproven by the developers?
Yeah.
So, anyway, I have really no idea, Mark.
I mean, do you think it could be something to do with his claims over decentralization? So, like, he's saying that because non-mining nodes don't count as nodes, therefore Bitcoin's only got, X number of nodes in the tens rather than in the tens of thousands. Do you think that could be playing into it here?
Yeah, that is also a subject that we have different thoughts about, so to say. For him, decentralization means that the protocol is set in stone, while the rest of the world thinks that decentralization has to do with a pretty large number of nodes that are set up all over the world, so we can call it really decentralized, and it cannot be easily brought down by any, whatever actor is trying to bring down Bitcoin.
What's even more important here is the role of developers. Wright maintains that all developers are paid for their work, either through a salary or sponsorship, which of course references the Blockstream MasterCard conspiracy that lies at the heart of the BSV narrative. Wright also claims that, quote, "In the case of the Bitcoin Association and the BCH developer, Roger Ver, in relation to their networks, each of them controls and directs the development and can approve the software used on the network. They use other individual developers to carry out the development that they direct and control." Unquote. Ver denies that this is the case, saying, quote, "The term developer is neither an accurate nor apposite term," unquote, as it applies to him, with Ver denying that he's a software developer at all, saying that he, quote, "learned rudimentary coding skills at high school but does not have the knowledge or experience to make changes to the BCH software or any other similar software," unquote. He admits that he has suggested changes to the Bitcoin Cash network, some of which have been implemented and some of which haven't, and that he has never received payment for his work. As far as the other defendants go, Wright says, quote, in the case of the BTC and ABC developers, Bitcoin Cash developers, the same position applies, except that various of the individuals in question also conduct the actual development of the software themselves, unquote. Importantly, Wright also adds that all developers, quote, make decisions about the software to be applied in relation to the network in question. They make decisions about the policy choices to be embedded in the code and how best technically to manifest those choices. While others may propose changes to the software, it is the relevant developers who decide what software changes in fact to make and implement, unquote. Arthur, what did the Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash developers say about these assertions?
Well, let's start with the eCash developers, Mark. This is a quote from their defense. As to the claimant's legal case, this rests on an allegation that the defendants owe it, and, by necessary implication, all owners of cryptocurrency worldwide, a fiduciary duty to make changes to the underlying rules of the system whenever access to cryptocurrency is lost. That would not only see the disparate private individual defendants acting as worldwide guarantors and bailiffs to the entire cryptocurrency system, but would also have them change the very rules by which the fiduciary relationship is said to have arisen. It is inconceivable that a fiduciary duty could exist to do an act which is inconsistent with the very rules giving rise to that fiduciary relationship. The 15 and 16 defendants do not have the powers ascribed to them. Multiple versions of software can be and are currently run simultaneously on the eCash blockchain. Anyone can propose software changes, and the 15 and 16 defendants have no power to compel network participants to run any particular software. In reality, however, the proposed changes would never be accepted by nodes who actually build the blockchain and who are largely anonymous and wholly autonomous. The relief sought by this claim is thus highly unlikely ever to materialize in practice, and any order would be futile. But you also asked about the Bitcoin developers too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, basically they say the same, but they have their own words and detailing in their defense. For example, and I like this part, it summarizes so nicely why Bitcoin developers have no power whatsoever. The so-called developers are no more than members of a voluntary community of contributors. Any use of the word developers in this defense is used in this sense. Neither they nor others have the power to force users in the BTC network to use any particular software. Each user of the BTC network chooses and controls the software they use. Bitcoin Core and other BTC network software do not automatic or force updates. So there you go, Mark.
Wright also couldn't resist getting a nugget regarding private keys into his argument, purely to bolster his case that they're not sacrosanct, that coins can move without them, and that holding them doesn't necessarily mean you own the coins associated with them. Ver and the Bitcoin Cash developers also had something to say about Wright's assertions over the private keys, with the developers stating that, quote, the requirement to use a private key to effect a transfer is fundamental to the design of the blockchain, unquote, with Ver adding that this fact is noted very clearly in the Bitcoin white paper. Arthur, this issue of private keys is also critical to this case, and we can expect a great deal of argument surrounding it at trial. What points did the Bitcoin developers raise in reference to Wright's perspective?
Mark, allow me to fine-tune things a little. How I see it, we have a few critical things in this case, and as you said, the private keys question is one of them. We have the question, can Craig prove he ever owned the 1 Feeks and 12 IB7 addresses, and were these coins ever stolen from him, and is he entitled to have them back? And the answer is, of course, no, full stop. There's no doubt whatsoever that this part will be ruled as a false case again, because it is. But then the judges will still look at the question if there is or not a fiduciary duty of the developers. And whatever the outcome of that, Craig Wright will of course not profit from it, because his case is false and he will get a ruling to that extent. But what if the judges say, worst case scenario, Bitcoin is not decentralized, Bitcoin developers have a fiduciary duty, and they cannot hide behind the MIT license? And one of those duties is to help freeze, confiscate and reappoint stolen funds with code proposals for digital asset recovery. And within these code proposals, based on fiduciary duty law that is created by then, or the occasional incidental court order, it is allowed, or even obligated, to go against Satoshi's principle of only private keys can and should be used to move ownership of Bitcoin from one anonymous person to the other anonymous person. And code proposals based on fiduciary duty law, or again the court order, should be accepted at all times by all nodes worldwide, otherwise these nodes will be sanctioned technically and financially. Don't ask me how they will do that, but to make this fiduciary duty thing work to some extent, the ruling in the Pineapple Hack case should say something about these things. So to cut a long story short, Mark, I think this covers all the important elements of the case, and as you said, overruling the private keys principle is one of them.
When it comes to the ownership of the coins in question, there is no doubt from any of the defendants that Wright and TTL never possessed the coins it says were stolen. When it comes to proof of ownership of the coins, the Bitcoin developers aren't taking any chances, saying that they would, quote, require the authenticity of every document disclosed to them or relied upon by TTL to be proved at trial, unquote. Should be fun. Here we turn to the history of two Bitcoin addresses, one beginning 1FEEX, known as 1FEEX, and the address beginning 12IB7. Arthur, before we go into the history of the 1FEEX address, what does Wright say about the 12IB7 address and its contents?
Basically, Craig Wright, he points at the public Bitcoin address on the Bitcoin rich list, and with help of a block explorer, he describes what's happening on that address. And by doing this, he is implying that it proves that he owns and controls that address. This is just a quote from the particulars of claim. TTL owns the Bitcoin in the addresses, amongst many others. Specifically, 12IB7 contains approximately 31,000 tokens on each network, comprising approximately 1.22 billion worth of BTC, approximately 20.9 million worth of BCH, again British pounds, approximately 6.7 million worth of BSV, and approximately 0.7 million of ABC, which is eCash now. Various transactions were undertaken on the 12IB7 address over the period of May the 13th of 2010 up till July 25 of 2010, leaving a net amount of 31,000 Bitcoin. What is he proving here? He is proving here that he can read on Block Explorer. And that is what everybody can do, and everybody can make this claim.
Yeah. This scant support offered by Wright explains why none of the three defendants goes into much detail about it, with the Bitcoin Cash developers giving it the most attention with just a couple of sentences. Quote, TTL has failed to particularize when and how it claims to have taken ownership of the coin in the 12IB7 address. TTL did not exist in 2010. It is denied, if intended to be alleged, that the transactions identified in paragraph 31 were carried out by or on behalf of TTL, unquote. The story surrounding the 1FEEX address is, of course, much different, and is an area certainly worth diving into. Craig Wright's version of events is fairly simple. He bought the 79,956 Bitcoin on behalf of one of his companies, Craig Wright R&D Trust, from a Russian currency exchange in 2011 in return for his Liberty Reserve dollars, and had them delivered to the 1FEEX address. The coins then changed ownership when Craig Wright R&D Trust became wrapped up in the Tulip Trust later in 2011, which was owned, in part, by TTL. These coins remained untouched until the Pineapple Hack in 2020, when he lost access, hence why he wants them back. Simple. Or not. Let's look at Wright's claim in more detail, using the arguments from the three defendants and what we know from other sources. We'll gauge the truth or otherwise of the statements contained within this story with the use of handy sound effects. Wright says that he bought the coins in February 2011, which, according to his other claims, would have been just weeks after he abandoned Bitcoin, complaining that it was being used on Silk Road, and right after locking up over 1 million of them in the Tulip Trust. His argument is that Bitcoin was the best way to get his money off Liberty Reserve, the illegal pseudo-bank used by criminals to launder illegally obtained money, on which he says he had something in the region of $30 million from, quote, gaming operations and sportsbook operations, unquote. Wright decides that the best way to swap Liberty Reserve dollars for Bitcoins is through Russian currency exchange WMIRK, which has never dealt in Bitcoin before, and casually calls them up, asking how many Bitcoin he can get for his Liberty Reserve dollars. He is told 80,000, which, given that the value of Bitcoin at the time is just shy of $1, suggests that either Wright only in fact has around $75,000 on Liberty Reserve, or WMIRK is trying to sell him Bitcoin at $375 per coin. Wright's wife Lynn types up a purchase order to confirm the deal, which she does using an online template that won't be released for another 4 years, on which she states that the exchange rate agreed between Wright and WMIRK is $21.01 per Bitcoin. This puts the final bill at $1.7 million, representing a 2,200% markup for WMIRK, and confusing the situation even further. Wright will eventually put this discrepancy down to the value of Liberty Reserve dollars being, quote, substantially less than the equivalent amount in US dollars, and he's not wrong. To make his sums work out, each Liberty Reserve dollar would have to be worth 0.05 of a cent, and there is no suggestion that it ever depegged to that extent, especially given that it was centrally controlled by Liberty Reserve itself. WMIRK also demands a $75 mining fee, which Wright is happy to pay, with the exchange saying that rather than just sending the coins to Wright's own address, which any company that has never handled Bitcoin before should have done, it will instead go to the lengths of creating a new Bitcoin address and having the coins sent there, before handing the private key over to Wright, presumably swearing on the Russian synodal Bible that it will delete the key afterwards. Wright sees no potential issue with WMIRK handing over the private key rather than the coins, which also neatly avoids any blockchain record and awaits delivery of the key. On March 1st, WMIRK delivers the key, only for Wright to discover that the exchange has sent only 79,956 of the promised 80,000 Bitcoin over. Wright, once again, has been duped, but he doesn't seem to mind. He also doesn't notice, why would he, that the coins have originated from an address owned by crypto exchange Mt. Gox, with that specific Bitcoin transfer being referenced directly by its owners just days later as a hack on the exchange's hot wallet. Shall we keep going? Let's. Ownership of the coins is transferred when Craig Wright R&D Trust becomes the Tulip Trust in 2011, which is itself partly owned by Tulip Trading Limited, despite TTL not existing until it was bought and renamed by Wright in 2014. Dave Kleiman creates a paper wallet for the OneFeeks address in 2012 and emails Wright about it, signing off with a signature that metadata proves wouldn't have been created until a year after his death. This paper wallet manages to have wonky text and QR codes, a background pattern that wouldn't come out for another 2 years, and a different font to all other wallets created on that website at that time. In 2015, Wright starts shopping this paper wallet around and uses its contents as collateral for a life-saving $15 million loan from Calvin Ayre, which allows him to pay his various debts. He, Ayre, and Stephen Matthews verify the contents of the wallet, which goes into a bank vault in Singapore with Wright and one of Matthews or Ayre as joint key holders. Wright also retains the private keys on his home computer, backed up in an encrypted format with 2 different cloud service providers, totally undermining the point of the joint key holder approach and leaving the keys vulnerable to hackers. However, given that the keys are in the hands of one of the world's leading computer security experts, they will probably be fine. Wright presumably doesn't tell Matthews and Ayre that he has retained a copy of the private keys, or if he does, they aren't at all concerned by this major lapse in security. This story, obviously, was taken down by the defendants in a glorious and comprehensive manner. When it comes to the OneFeeks wallet, the purchase order, the $75 mining fee, the shortfall in Bitcoin received by Wright, the upper and lower case address confusion, the random purchase price and Mt. Gox's relationship to the OneFeeks wallet, all are referenced by the Bitcoin developers, who label the lack of critical information regarding the alleged purchase as, quote, embarrassing, unquote. They also add some extras in for good measure, including Wright was offered the chance to sign the 1 Feeks and 12 IB7 addresses by the ATO to prove they were his, and didn't. The 2 addresses weren't among the 16,000 in the bonded courier's pouch in 2020 that Wright purported to own. TTL didn't report the ownership of any Bitcoin between July 2011 and May 2017, and failed to mention any Bitcoin holdings when asked by the registered agent of TTL what the company owned. Arthur, there's even more to this story of the 1 Feeks wallet, isn't there?
Oh yeah, Mark, for sure. We don't see it mentioned in this detail in one of the defenses, but the 1 Feeks address was one of several Bitcoin addresses that Craig Wright used during his Australian tax fraud era around 2013 to 2015. And in 2021, I wrote an article, a long-form article about the whole history of 1 Feeks. And in that article, I extensively quote from an ATO report where Craig his fraudulent scheme around MGF mining and W&K is unraveled to the level that ATO says that it's all a nullity based on sham. Now, and intertwined in this story is also the 1 Feeks address. So allow me to give you a quote.
Mm-hmm.
In your case, we consider there was a scheme which involved you acquiring software from MJF and W&K in order for it to be supplied to your related entities so as to generate GST refunds in Coinex, Hotwire and Cloudcroft. Those are 3 companies that he had.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he had more companies, but those 3 were involved with this part of the fraud.
Mm-hmm.
Then the ATO continues, you had initially planned to use Bitcoin to fund these transactions in such a way that you would never lose control or access to those Bitcoins. However, on receipt of the private binding ruling advising you that the supply of Bitcoin in consideration for an acquisition would be a taxable supply, you altered the scheme to insert the Seychelles Trust. Here we find traces of the Julep Trust, as you can see, to which you transferred the Bitcoin. Once possessed of the Bitcoin, the trustee then entered into a loan agreement with you, enabling you to draw down on the loan in Bitcoin. Consequently, your related entities made creditable acquisitions of software and intellectual property, but had negative net amounts because there was no corresponding GST liability arising from their provision of consideration. On this scheme, the avoiders are Craig Wright, Coinex, Cloudcroft and De Morgan. What is happening here in the scheme that he is setting up here, that works with trusts. The trusts owned the Bitcoin and probably at this moment in time that I was just reading to you, also the 1 Feeks address was offshore, and then they take loans on the Bitcoin in those trusts. That is how the scheme worked here.
I seem to remember as well we've got another instance of private keys being used to pay for something here, because I believe Wright, in paying for this software through this MJF mining scam, that he allegedly gave them 6 addresses containing the amount of Bitcoin needed to purchase the software. But again, he gave them these addresses and said, I'll send you the private keys, which is totally bizarre, but also just so happens to be what WMIRK allegedly did to get him the Bitcoin that they bought for him. So it's just this obvious parallel here.
There were several constructions, and it just depends a bit on the moment in time that you take and from which report you pull your information, because he has been setting up several claims and things, and that changed over the years, because the MGF mining storing you can find it probably in 3 or 4 different variations in all the reports.
Okay. What did the defendants make of Wright's claims? Roger Ver agreed that there is no evidence that Wright owned any of these coins, and says that there is also a lack of evidence that Wright actually held the Liberty Reserve dollars he used to pay for them, which is true. The Bitcoin Cash developers are equally unequivocal in their opinions. Quote, it is denied that TTL owns or has ever owned the Bitcoin in the addresses. Ongoing statements to the contrary are fraudulent and amount to perjury and or contempt of court by Dr. Wright, and the 15th and 16th defendants reserve the right to seek such sanctions as are appropriate in respect thereof following the trial. Unquote. They also have something to say about the evidence Wright is using to back up his claims. Quote, Contrary to TTL's security for costs evidence, which stated that the coins have been owned by TTL since at least 2011, TTL did not exist in 2011, nor did WMIRK.com deal in Bitcoin at that time. The purchase order relied on by TTL and Dr. Wright is a forgery. In fact, the coins registered to the OneFeeks address are understood to have been stolen from the Mt. Gox exchange. This argument is repeated with regard to the 12IB7 address, where it is mentioned again that TTL didn't exist when the address received its first Bitcoin in 2010, and they deny that the transactions regarding the address have anything to do with TTL. The next objection raised is one of timing. As most people listening to this will know, when a blockchain undergoes a hard fork and a new currency is formed off the back of it, anyone holding coins on the original chain is airdropped the same amount of new coins on the forked chain. Of course, with many such forks taking place since 2017, Wright has claimed ownership of all the coins from all the forks in both wallets, but the Bitcoin Cash developers argue that this shouldn't count. Quote, "It is common ground that the creation of the eCash blockchain, referred to by the claimant as Bitcoin Cash ABC, did not take place until many years after Tulip's alleged purchase, and several months after the alleged hack. The claim against the 15th and 16th defendants therefore consists of the generic proposition that whenever a fork takes place on any network giving rise to a new blockchain, irrespective of who creates that fork and for what purpose, fiduciary duties must thereby immediately arise in favour of all owners of a coin on that new blockchain. The claim is hopeless." Unquote. Arthur, this is a good point. Wright is claiming ownership of coins that weren't even in existence at the time of the hack, isn't he?
Yeah, well, more that the imaginary fiduciary duties were not called upon in time, it appears to me. But yeah, good point. And I'm very curious what the judge will think of this rebuttal.
The Bitcoin Cash developers also made an interesting inference regarding the way in which the coins were stored. Quote, "Neither Dr. Wright nor TTL have ever held the private keys, or means of accessing the private keys, associated with the address for the reasons set out above. It is noted that TTL alleges that the private keys to the addresses were contained in encrypted wallet.dat files. Only Bitcoin Core and its derivatives use wallet.dat files, meaning that the keys in question must have been kept in an MIT licensed wallet. It is therefore to be inferred that TTL and or others acting on its behalf expressly accepted the terms of the MIT license." Wright in fact mentioned this issue in a tweet thread just days ago, agreeing that Bitcoin was released under an MIT license, but saying that the license is only active if the protocol remains the same. Quote, "Bitcoin was released with the caveat that the protocol was set in stone. While that allows copying, it doesn't allow copying and calling it Bitcoin or using the database. Instead, it's an open license for the idea. That isn't the same thing as taking the protocol and changing it. When the protocol is set in stone, when it cannot change, development can occur, but no individual can force a path that changes what others are doing. That is the only way to make a system that is permissionless." Unquote. Arthur, what's the importance of all these references to the MIT license?
I think this is going to be an important thing in the case. What influence does the MIT license have here? And I think we should not underestimate the importance of this point. Either there will be a shockwave through the whole open source industry when the judge overrules the MIT license and thinks there are fiduciary duties for developers, or there will be a global sigh of relief when indeed the MIT license is a valid license to protect against bad and good actors requesting fiduciary duties when there are, by law, none in open source projects. So again, do not underestimate this point.
Yeah, I mean, this was what I was referring to earlier when I mentioned the importance of this case, because, I mean, there's going to be developers from every branch you could think of in IT and what have you that have no idea this case is going ahead or the impact it could have. So you could find out, if Craig Wright wins, that everyone in the entire open source development community is affected, and they would have no idea until they're getting sued for it.
Yep. And of course, we can at this moment think that we will not run a risk that this is going to be a dangerous case. But oh my God, what will happen when there is a silly judge thinking that there are fiduciary duties and the MIT license is not valid? I see a shockwave going through especially the open source communities.
Yep, absolutely. Now we get to the juice in this particularly rancid barrel of oranges, the hack. Once again, cobbling together Wright's version of events and the issues raised by the developers, here's what supposedly happened. Cue the music! In August 2019, Wright tells an interviewer that the world will soon find out that court orders can force miners to move coins, for example, in the event of a theft of private keys, something he says the world will soon find out. 10 months later, Wright's home is broken into by an expert hacking gang, which knocks out Wright's multiple CCTV operations and plants a Pineapple Wi-Fi device behind his television. This allows them to access his home network, which they utilise to wipe 37GB worth of cloud data, which, Wright says, may or may not have included the private keys to the 2 addresses. Having discovered the hack, Wright, whose wife will soon sue Ira Kleiman for wiping Dave Kleiman's hard drives following his death, wipes all his hard drives, thus removing any possibility for digital forensics investigators to assess any element of the hack. He then fails to inform the police of the home invasion and the hack until the following day, potentially ruining the chance to get vital forensic clues from the scene. Wright either forgets or doesn't know that the wiped data, including the keys, will remain accessible with the cloud providers for 30 days after the hack, a fact that could have negated this entire lawsuit. Wright and the police keep the hack secret, despite it being worth at least $1.1 billion at the time, 3 times the value of the biggest robbery in Britain up to that point, missing the chance to solicit the public for eyewitnesses. When Wright finally does mention the hack 3 weeks later, it isn't to ask for help in getting his coins back, but is instead in the context of suing the developers of 3 blockchains, claiming they failed in their fiduciary duty to prevent the coins from being taken out of his control. The contents of the 2 addresses remain untouched to this day, which either means that the hackers are biding their time to move the coins, or they can't get access after all, a major oversight for such an operation, and one you'd have thought they would have planned for. They also, like good hacking gangs, left evidence of their deeds behind them in the form of the Pineapple device, which Wright handed over as proof that the hack definitely happened. Having relied on the funds to secure the $15 million bailout from Calvin Ayre, Wright no longer has the ability to pay Ayre back, and there is no suggestion from Wright that he had insured the assets, despite cryptocurrency insurance products being available in the UK at the time. Luckily, however, Ayre doesn't hold a grudge and writes off the debt, unperturbed by the fact that Wright kept, lost, and then failed to retrieve, when it was piddlingly easy, the private keys to the One Feeks address. Meanwhile, the paper wallet itself is supposedly still sitting in a Singapore vault, which Wright could have retrieved at any point in the last 3 years to move the coins to his own address, but has chosen, instead, to launch an expensive, multi-year lawsuit. Arthur, we covered the utter nonsense behind this supposed hack in Series 1, but these filings throw up some new nuggets, most notably something raised by the Bitcoin Cash developers, and I quote, "It is denied that the alleged hackers deleted and or copied the private keys or any associated access information. TTL fails to particularize what other information and assets are alleged to have been stolen," unquote. Now, this is a very good point. Pretending for a second that this hack actually took place, yeah, I know, but let's just play along. Wright says that it can only be, quote, inferred that they, the hackers, made copies of the TTL private keys and or the keys access material before deleting them, unquote. So he doesn't even say for definite that the keys were actually stolen. He just assumes that they were, when in fact the logical assumption is that they weren't stolen because the coins haven't actually moved anywhere. And he's actually taking these people to court over a theft that he can't even be sure took place.
Yeah, that's a good analysis, Mark. I mean, we knew beforehand that the hack story is completely created from thin air, of course. Craig Wright never owned those assets that he claims to have controlled, so they could never have been stolen from him in the first place. Full stop. But then it becomes even more clear that the whole thing is a fairy tale when Craig Wright himself can even create a logical timeline with logical events that took place. And then he needs to cover old lies with new lies, and then the story becomes even more weak.
Now, of course, the reason why Wright can't be sure whether the keys were stolen or not is because he wiped his entire hard drive when he discovered he'd been hacked, which he explains thus, quote, "This may appear odd to some people, but I did so because I did not know how the hackers obtained access to my computer. I have been the subject of cyber attacks for many years. It was also critical to me to get my systems up and running without undue delay. My computer contained a great deal of confidential information, among other things. I wiped my hard drive in order to ensure all malware and other threats were removed from my network, and it was simply not practicable to take a copy of any of these drives." Unquote. Now bear in mind that Wright says he has several, nay dozens, of IT security qualifications and has boasted about the calibre of the companies he's helped keep secure over the years, when I tell you that this is the basic advice that the UK police gives out if you suspect to have been a victim of cybercrime. Quote, "Do not tamper with the computer. Avoid making changes to the affected computer, such as wiping the hard drive or attempting to fix it yourself. Tampering with the system can potentially destroy valuable evidence that could help in the investigation and recovery process." Arthur, what did the defendants make of Wright's claim to have wiped his system?
Yeah, first let's see what the Bitcoin developers said, and I'll quote, "Dr. Wright claims to have wiped his hard drive shortly after the alleged hack, which he would not have done had the relevant private keys or the key's access material been stolen. Dr. Wright did not contact Microsoft or Google to attempt to recover the relevant private keys or the key's access material following the alleged hack." No, it's as simple as that indeed. And Roger Ver also had something to say, and I'll quote from him from his defense. "The 14th defendant, Roger Ver himself, denies that any hack of Dr. Wright's personal computer and or network took place between the 5th and the 8th of February 2020 or at all. It is denied that TTL or Dr. Wright was ever in possession of or held the private keys or means of access to the private keys to the tokens at the 1FEEX or 12IB7 addresses." The e-case developers also said something about this same point, and I'll quote again. "Whilst the 15th and 16th defendants have no direct knowledge as to whether Dr. Wright's computer and or network were unlawfully accessed between the 5th and the 8th of February 2020, it is to be inferred from the circumstances that no such hack took place. In particular, A. It is denied that Dr. Wright's computer and or network contained the private keys or means of accessing the private keys associated with the addresses. And B. Nobody with the knowledge which Dr. Wright claims to enjoy would wipe their hard drives rather than disconnect them from the network, particularly in view of the nature of the information said to be held on the relevant computers, or fail to attempt to restore the data from the OneDrive and or Google Cloud. It is noted that Dr. Wright claims to have been unable to locate a record as to which files has been accessed and or wiped during the hack as to the system logs had been erased, but has failed to specify what record he would have expected to have found."
I love it. He had no idea what was on the computer. There's no record of what was on the computer, and there never will be because it was completely wiped immediately against police advice.
Well, yeah, that's it.
Yeah, it's a likely story. We also heard the first mention of a forensic report carried out on his computer. What are the details here?
Yeah, the e-case developers actually say something about it, and I'll quote again. "In or around February or March 2020, Dr. Wright procured a report from Mr. John Douglas of First Response, an IT forensics expert who attended Dr. Wright's home and performed an investigation. Mr. Douglas was only able to produce a very brief report, and it is accordingly to be inferred that he found no evidence of a hack."
Wright also wants us to believe that he didn't think to contact Microsoft or Google about the supposed theft of over $1 billion in cryptocurrencies from their servers, and that no one he spoke to suggested doing the same. This is important because, as Roger Ver noted, quote, "Cloud-based backup systems have features that enable the deleted data to be restored. Further, users of cloud-based backup systems can request deleted data to be restored." Unquote. We'll stay with Ver for his summary of Wright's actions over the hack. Quote, "The explanation as to how Dr. Wright failed on TTL's case to ensure that private keys to valuable assets were backed up is incredible. It is inconceivable, on TTL's case, that Dr. Wright, as someone who professes to have IT skills and particular expertise in IT security, did not take steps to secure or to restore the backups of such materials immediately upon becoming aware that the private keys and or means of access to the private keys to the tokens at the 1fex and 12ib7 addresses had been deleted, together with other information and assets which Dr. Wright claims was stolen from him and others." Unquote. In summary, the defendants argue that Craig Wright never owned the coins and wasn't hacked, and even if he was, he pretty much did everything possible to avoid getting them back, including making basic errors that could have helped police gather information needed to solve the case. As Roger Ver summarised, quote, "All assertions are false and are made dishonestly." Unquote. The Bitcoin Cash developers also cast doubt on whether Wright actually did report the hack to the police. Quote, "To the extent that Dr. Wright reported the alleged misappropriation to the Surrey police, which is not admitted, it was a false claim. TTL has also failed to particularise the outcome of any investigation carried out by Surrey police." Arthur, if this absolute work of fiction is allowed even more than a cursory glance by the judges, then there's a serious issue with the British justice system, isn't there? I mean, this simply did not happen.
Of course this didn't happen. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that at some point during this case, presuming the case doesn't implode beforehand, because Craig Wright takes a one-way hike abroad, or he is found with a pair of large concrete shoes at the bottom of the sea, just a few miles out of Antigua. I'm just hinting.
Yeah.
I don't mean anything with this, and no, I'm not trying to imply that any violence should take place, of course.
Is that a threat?
No, not, of course not, of course not. Then the defendants will come up with witness statements from the police officers involved with the inquiry of this mega heist that never happened. And then we will likely find out that they shelved the case based on no evidence or something like that. I mean, we never heard of this whole case in any serious magazine, and not even in an...
I mean, it never even made the local newspaper.
That's it. So the biggest heist ever in the UK, probably on the whole globe, it never came in the presses. This case has been shelved, has not been taken seriously by the police. We cannot get our hands on the full story there yet. Maybe the developers will dive into that a bit more and find out what has happened there. Then we might see that evidence pop up in this case later, or mentioned in an order by one of the judges.
Of course, the whole point of this sorry saga is the idea of fiduciary duty, with Wright saying that developers owe a duty of care to coin holders, and blames the developers for breaching this duty of care by not getting him his coins back following the theft. This, he alleges, is perfectly simple to remedy. Quote, "Developers can change their software so as to allow a person who does not know the private key to control and access the Bitcoin in question. By way of just one example, developers can provide control of and access to the Bitcoin by transferring the tokens to a new address under the control of the legitimate owner. The legitimate owner will therefore have the private keys to the new address and can control and access the Bitcoin that he owns from that new address." Unquote. Wright also claimed that identifying fraud and allowing a Bitcoin owner access to lost or stolen coins is, quote, "not a particularly difficult exercise for the developers to undertake," unquote. Arthur, what was the response to these claims?
Well, the Bitcoin developers, they hit the nail on the head where they say that, and I will quote again, "The reasons why a private key is required to transfer Bitcoin include the following, of which it is averred the inventor of Bitcoin, Satoshi Nakamoto, would be aware." Hint, hint. "It is inherent in the design of the Bitcoin system that a user's private key are required to undertake a transaction, and it would be inconsistent with the foundational principles of the Bitcoin system to permit access to coins without the private key. It is admitted that developers can write the software referred to in the second and third sentences, but to do so would be 1. Contrary to the basic principles of the Bitcoin system, and 2. Of no utility. Developers have no power to compel nodes to use such software, and it is inevitable that they will not use such software, since to do so would be contrary to the basic principles of the Bitcoin system. Even if the developers were to write the software referred to in the second and third sentences, the so-called legitimate owner would not be able to access the Bitcoin except on a new network formed by nodes that agreed to use that software, which they would not. And unsurprisingly, the eCash developers and Roger Ver agree with this, and they say pretty much the same thing for their own blockchains. Although the eCash developers also add this. In any event, TTL has failed to particularize the specific software changes which it seeks, given that, as set out above, the underlying software is publicly available. TTL is entitled to make any changes it wishes to the software and to seek to persuade nodes to run that amended software. It has made no such attempt, at least in respect to the eCash blockchain. No claim can properly be advanced by TTL for amendments to the software without specifying precisely and in terms what code amendments are being requested. And they also say that they do not have the power attributed to them, nor do they exercise any discretion or make choices in relation to the eCash blockchain. As regards the Bitcoin ABC software, they have no greater power to make and approve changes than any other reviewer. Now, and lastly, Roger Ver adds that he doesn't even know whether such software could be written and says that it wouldn't be adopted even if it was.
Wright further argues the blockchain developers have control over all coins in a system, including any stolen from an owner, which they can return at will, and that they can also stop a transaction that is known to be fraudulent or to reverse a known fraudulent transaction. Unsurprisingly, this is denied by the Bitcoin developers, who argue that, quote, while it is possible for someone, including Dr. Wright, to create such software, no one, including the developers, has the power to require users to adopt it. Any attempt by the developers to persuade others to adopt it, whether as a result of a court order or otherwise, if it had any effect at all, would lead to a hard fork, and a substantial number of users would reject such a proposal as contrary to the foundational principles of the Bitcoin system. Even if, contrary to the above, any such software were to be adopted by users, it would only grant access to coins on the new forked cryptocurrency, which would likely be worthless or of limited value, not to the coins that TTL alleges to have owned and lost." Unquote. The Bitcoin Cash developers expand on this idea, saying that they are, quote, unable to ensure anything in respect of an alleged fraud. In line with the white paper, all transactions are recorded on the blockchain, transactions are irreversible, ownership is anonymous, there is no mediation of disputes, and there is no trusted third party. Unquote. This, they add, means that they have, quote, no knowledge of the true owners of coins, would be unable to ascertain whether or not the fraud has taken place, cannot reverse transactions, and cannot mediate disputes. Moreover, they have no control over the software run by nodes. As described above, anybody, including TTL, can amend the software and seek to persuade nodes to accept it. Given that the proposed changes are contrary to the fundamental principles in the white paper, such changes are highly unlikely to be accepted. Even if, which is denied, developers do have some or substantial power over the system in which digital assets are held, it is denied that they owe any fiduciary duties to TTL or anyone else as a result. There is no entrustment of any property to the developers, and in the cryptocurrency community there is no reasonable expectation that developers, whatever power they may or may not have, will act in the interests of the owner of Bitcoin to the exclusion of their own interest and that of a third party. Unquote. Arthur, did the other defendants agree with this perspective?
Oh yeah, absolutely. They might word it a little differently here and there, but the message is always the same. Developers have no power whatsoever to help victims of theft or other financial crime in any meaningful sense.
Wright also claims that a crypto holder has no redress to getting their coins back without involving the developers in some way, who can simply wield their magic wands and get the coins back. However, as the Bitcoin developers point out, were the thieves identified and prosecuted, they could be made to hand either the coins or their monetary value over if found guilty. It's almost worth trying to catch them, isn't it, Craig? The Bitcoin developers sign off their defense with a summary of their position over the question of fiduciary duty. Quote, it is not reasonably foreseeable to the developers that there is any step that is within their power to take that could achieve the objective TTL wishes it to achieve, nor is it reasonably foreseeable to the developers that any user of the Bitcoin system would rely on them to take such a step and suffer loss if they do not." Unquote. The Bitcoin Cash developers offer a similar message, adding that, quote, "TTL is responsible for its own alleged losses. The simple answer to this claim is that, in accordance with the rules of the system, any owner should keep their private key secure and backed up, and the consequences if they fail to do so are known, accepted, and at their own risk." Unquote. Roger Ver simply ends by telling Craig Wright to fuck off. He doesn't, sadly, but it wouldn't be a surprise if he did. Instead, he too denies that he, quote, "owes TTL any fiduciary duty," unquote, and further denies that he has, quote, "any power to give TTL access or control of the BCH tokens at the 1 Feeks or 12 IP7 addresses on the BCH blockchain," unquote. Arthur, let's take a step back and look at what's really going on here. Craig Wright knows that he will never get those coins back, at least not the Bitcoin or Bitcoin Cash tokens, or if he does, then he's got a much worse grasp of blockchain technology than any of us realises. For me, this means that he is using the hack as a platform for the whole fiduciary duty thing, but then we have to ask ourselves why. The answer, weirdly enough, might come in the Bitcoin ETF application recently filed by BlackRock, in which they are legally bound to list any known risk factors behind their application. And here is where Craig Wright gets a mention, and I quote, "If a court decides to grant the relief requested by Craig Wright in this specific case, it is possible that wide-ranging and fundamental changes to the source code, operations and governance of and basic principles underlying the Bitcoin network might be required, and a loss of public confidence in the Bitcoin network could result. Alternatively, Bitcoin could face obstacles to use in the United Kingdom, which could reduce adoption. Courts in other jurisdictions could take similar positions. These or other possible outcomes could lead to a decrease in the value of Bitcoin, which could negatively impact the value of the shares." Has BlackRock just stated Wright's true rationale here?
Yeah, it appears so, doesn't it? Especially the part, it is possible that wide-ranging and fundamental changes to the source code, operations and governance of and basic principles underlying the Bitcoin network might be required. Yeah, it leaves no room for doubt how BlackRock is judging the actions of Craig Wright.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what's next in this case? As of last week, the matter was straightforward, but Arthur, what happened recently that changes the complexion of this case and in fact all Craig Wright's cases in the UK?
Well, there was already a trial set for January 2024 in the COPA versus Wright lawsuit, and now Judge Meller takes the Kraken and the Coinbase etc. cases all together. An issue arises in all 4 actions as to whether Dr. Craig Stephen Wright is Satoshi Nakamoto. The identity issue and such other closely related issues as arise in each of the 4 actions can conveniently, cost-effectively and justly be tried at the trial set for the COPA claim, commencing in January 2024. So what we see happen here, Mark, is that all the defenses are going to be combined and all the resources are going to be pooled together for this.
So then the ruling that happens in this case will impact every other UK case he's got going, including the Pineapple Hack case?
Yep.
So it seems then that this case, like all the others apart from COPA, will now be on hold until January 2024. But of course, if there are any updates, then you know where to find them. Arthur, thank you once again for joining me for this deep dive into the Pineapple Hack case.
Yeah, you're welcome, Mark.
I'll see you for the next one.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Dr. Bitcoin, the man who wasn't Satoshi Nakamoto. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on your podcast platform of choice to get these episodes the moment they drop, and if you enjoyed what you heard, we'd really appreciate a star rating and even a review to help us get this out to as many people as possible. Our monthly bonus episodes are available to download from our website for a small consideration, and if you'd like to access all these bonus episodes, plus these monthly updates a few days early and other goodies, you can do so by becoming a Dr. Bitcoin supporter through Patreon or Spotify. See the details in the show notes for information on how to do this, or head to our website drbitcoinpod.com. That's drbitcoinpod.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at drbitcoinpod, and you can email us at drbitcoinpod@gmail.com. That's drbitcoinpod@gmail.com. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll speak to you again soon.
You've been listening to Dr. Bitcoin, the man who wasn't Satoshi Nakamoto. Written by Mark Hunter, with additional material by Arthur Van Pelt. Editing and production by Mark Hunter. This has been a Contented Media production.